Hello and welcome to this week's Data Matters show. This week we're diving into the Internet of Things, which Wikipedia describes as a network of physical objects or things that are embedded with sensors, software and other technologies, all for the purpose of connecting and exchanging data and other devices and systems across the internet. Now today we are joined by a fantastic panel of leading experts to discuss this subject. Let me start by introducing Glen Hymers from Save the Children, Jen Stirrup from Relish, and Simon Langley from Covéa Insurance. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on each of these distinguished guests today. My name is Steve Wright. I'm a partner at Privacy Culture, and Data Matters is brought to you each week on behalf of Privacy Culture. So let me tell you, Simon is actually, it turns out, a qualified accountant who studied at Manchester and is now the CISO for Covéa Insurance.
French, so there is an acute accent on the E.
Wonderful. Prior to that, he was the CISO at Morrison's, where we first met, in aisle number 4. And he also spent many years at PwC and KPMG. My next guest is Jen Stirrup. Jen is MBA and CEO of Relish, what the industry describe as a true data champion. She worked in the space of artificial intelligence and business intelligence since 1997, when I was still riding around on my BMX. She's a keynote speaker around the world. That's a slight lie, actually, because 97 I was probably doing my A-levels or whatever, and is recognised as a world thought leader in the space of data and AI. Glen, excuse me, Glen Hymers is with us today. Welcome, Glen. And he's had 16 years with the RAF, both as a RAF police officer and as well as working in counterintelligence, which is fascinating. He is now the head of data protection and CISO at Save the Children, a fantastic charity. But he was also worked at Fujitsu and was CISO at the Prince's Trust, and is an expert in all things cyber and data, etc. Counter-terrorism as well. He can add crime prevention, business continuity. What a fantastic CV, Glen. So listen, thank you so much to my panel for joining us today on this much anticipated subject of the Internet of Things. Now, we've got hundreds of people tuning in today. I can see the questions lining up, so please start with them, and I'll try and get to them in the next 20 minutes or so. So, a recent report from Samsung says the need to secure every connected device by 2020 is critical. Now, obviously, along come a COVID, and we're all, things have perhaps been pushed back a little bit. But the firm's open economy document says there is a very clear danger that technology is running ahead of the game. And the firm goes on to say that there will be more than 7.3 billion devices that will need to be made secure by the manufacturers by 2021. So a lot of work to do out there. So I thought we'd start this week's show by just unpicking sort of, there are advantages and disadvantages from IoT, right? So I just thought I'd start with Simon and ask him the questions around Simon, can you give us some of the advantages of the IoT? And then I'll ask Jen for some disadvantages.
Okay. Now, one of the things that Steve didn't talk about is I am interested in IoT, but I actually spent quite a bit of time playing around with IoT things myself. I was waving there's a rotary encoder there attached to a development board. One of the interesting things that I found out when I first started doing this is just how cheap this stuff is. This development board cost £3, and this is an expensive one. So you can buy an internet connected device for less than £1. They are very, very cheap. So that's just the cheapness enables all sorts of possibilities that you wouldn't have with a much more expensive device. One of the things that I think is also really helpful is about they are specialized. So they tend to do just one thing and do one thing well. So we are trying to use an event-driven microservice architecture in the way we develop our new insurance platform at Covéa. Something like IoT fits in really well with that. So it's easy to fit into specific microservices. And there are all sorts of things that, from an insurance perspective, that we could do. One of the things we've talked about internally is, for example, having crash detectors in people's cars. So people don't have to phone us up. They can we can report it straight away. Similar things can be done with household protection. My next door neighbour had a pipe leak, and I hope you won't be able to hear the kitchen being replaced. If he had IoT detectors, then that could have shut the pipes off and prevented what was thousands of pounds worth of damage. They're also very efficient. They're really cheap. I mean, the amount of power that's needed to power one of these things, they'll run on a battery for months. So they're really efficient from a power use perspective. And they really open up all sorts of possibilities for collecting data that are really quite difficult to do. I was actually, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about using Wi-Fi buttons to carry out an action. It may be just to call somebody, say an elderly person might need some help. That would cost a few pounds to make. If you think about what we'd have had to do 20, 30 years ago with pagers that required an enormous, complex national infrastructure and all the rest of it, you can do something like that for literally just a few pounds now and develop them really, really quickly. Now, I could go on at some length, but I'll probably have more advantages to talk about during the course of the presentation.
Thank you, Simon. What a wonderful insight as well to how useful these things and accessible these devices are in our everyday world. So Jen, Simon's painted a really good advantages there, cheaper insurance, better security, better safety. Come on, give it to us. What's the bad? What should we be worried about?
Well, if you want a depressing answer, you should always ask someone who knows about data, and so here's the depressing answers, I'm afraid. I go into pour cold water and all of that. There's a new term out, which you may have heard, called fit leaking. I don't know if you've heard of this. Yeah. Those of you who are fitness fanatics, I'm sometimes dark in the inside of a gym before COVID myself. So you might know that Garmin, for example, recently paid multi-million amount of money in order to get themselves out of a situation they had, which was ransomware. And there was also quite an interesting case where in 2018, The Guardian reported that there was a fitness application called Strava, which gives you a data visualization map of its users. And unfortunately, it gave away locations of secret US military bases. And it did that because it was being used almost exclusively by the military in places like Afghanistan. So you had these glut of users accidentally giving away all their data and their location. So I think I've got security concerns about data generally speaking, and then you add in IoT on top of that. I don't think people always understand data very well, and they don't understand electronics either. I would never be able to build what Simon just showed you. It just wouldn't happen. I can barely wire a plug, and I think probably a lot of people are the same, or at least maybe not quite as bad as I am. But so I think we are getting into a world of the unknown. And the technology is running in front of us and away from us, and we don't realise it.
Fantastic. Thank you both. You've both come out of your corners swinging great punches, and I can't say after round one who's winning or losing at this stage. Too early to call. So I'll turn my next question towards Glen, and let's see what he has to say from the red corner. So IoT, Glen, offers us huge opportunities that have been alluded to here by our guests to be more efficient in how we do things, saving us time, money, and emissions in the process, which is great for the environment. It allows companies, governments, public authorities to think how or rethink how they can deliver these services and produce goods. So come on, I mean, I don't want to be biased, but surely it's a good thing, right?
Yeah, I would say on the face of it, yes. I think you can obviously detect which part of the corner I'm coming out from. On the face of it, yes, it's very good, and it provides lots of services, and it does all sorts of good things, like, as you say, monitor things like water leakage. So if, say for example, where I live I'm covered off by South West Water. If South West Water could have an IoT system which monitored the leakage from its pipes, we'd all be scared witless as to how much water we were actually wasting out through an archaic pipe system. But all joking aside, what it would do is be able to influence how they build their infrastructure, repair their infrastructure, and have that rolling program and target that infrastructure where it needs to be done. But on the other side, to Jen's point earlier, if it's not on Strava, did it actually happen? And that is the mentality and the mindset that goes on. And to hear Jen mention the 2018 Bagram leak, which was quite amusing because that caused a massive stir in all of us. And in my old world, and what we find is it's predominantly around the use of the actual data. People don't understand what data is actually being collected about them or what that data is being used for. And it's the effectiveness of collecting that data. An example of that is contact and trace at the moment. We're all going through this now. COVID, how many people around this forum have got the COVID-19 app downloaded on their phone to allow them? I haven't, and I know I haven't. And Simon's shaking his head away vigorously on the other end of this. And Steve, look at that. There we are. What does that tell you about what we think about the contact and data? And all you've got to do is look at the statistics recently where they're saying that less than 50% of the people that are contacted via or are attempted to contact via contact and trace are actually contacted and got hold of. So it's the effective use of the data. It's all well and good. And the other thing is we've got to look at local government. Local government, I hate to say it, having been in an MSSP before, it's the cheapest provision provided by the cheapest bidder. And yes, you try to do everything you can within the art of the possible, but if you don't have the money funds from government, then the backup and the statistics and the infrastructure is just not there. Everybody here will have heard the reports that they were running contact tracing in an Excel spreadsheet, for God's sake. So surely, yes, it has advantages, but we really do need to examine and look at how we collect the data, store the data, and process the data securely and correctly to make sure that those services work. Because without getting the basic underpinning right, all the other advantages that come with it are simply not there or are negligible.
So thank you. And Simon, what do you think? Is that? I mean, you seem to be coming from the same corner, maybe slightly different perspective.
No, a lot of this is down to the way it's used. I think the thing to bear in mind with IoT is that it's a tool, and like any tool, it can be used well or it can be used badly. I was just thinking about cars. Cars have huge advantages. It's given us a freedom we haven't had before. Huge disadvantages as well. Look at road accidents, pollution, and so on. And a lot of it is down to the way things are used and the way they're controlled. And I think that exactly the same thing is true with IoT. I know we're going to come on later in the talk about some ways we can protect ourselves and some specific weaknesses, but I think it's really down to understanding how the technology is being used and make sure that it's being controlled adequately, rather than it being good or bad. I think the technology itself is neutral in the same way as the internet is.
Jen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's about unintended consequences, or potentially consequences which are intended, which are leading to an imbalance of power. It feels like the knowledge and the control of the data itself is not residing with us as individuals, and instead it's in the hands of the big players. So Google and Apple both have services around health, to use that as an example. So because the imbalance of power isn't tipping in the favour of the individual, I think we can't really be clear in what those consequences might be. And I think companies seem to be very quick to apologise afterwards. But as we know, it seems to be almost incident of the week at the minute, and we're not in front of it, and we don't seem to be getting better at it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting because even this week I was reading reports, various different reports on the Internet of Things. The biggest concern, and I remember once I went to one of these hackathon things, and they put the kettle and the TV and even a baby doll that responded to voice, and they basically hacked. I won't tell you what they got the baby doll to say because it's slightly disturbing, but everything is connected to the internet can be hacked, I think is a true statement. And and obviously IoT is no exception to this. So in fact, Insecure Systems toy manufacturer, the toy manufacturer VTech, which I remember buying a lot of toys for my kids, made by VTech, lost videos and pictures of children using their connected devices, and that was a bit of a horrific story. But what then are some of these vulnerabilities for our audience, Simon? Perhaps I could start with you, and just, you know, seeing as you've been taking the bits apart, maybe you could help us understand just some of those vulnerabilities, and then I'll go to you, Glenn, and finally Jen.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that I've come across, and one of the things that's been clear to me is that the way, you know, I knock up a device, I made a device so that I could work out whether the tumble dryer had finished because it's in my cellar. I'm too lazy to walk all the way downstairs. Now, that took me, you know, 2 days, a couple of hours of faffing about. Part of the problem is a lot of devices that are sold commercially are the same. It's some side of the desk project. It's done in a really informal fashion. There isn't adequate testing. There often is, you know, the devices themselves have relatively limited resources. So the sorts of things that I would normally require for any internet communication, like, you know, having proper TLS certificates and mutual authentication, is really quite hard to do on a device that's only got a tiny amount of memory. The environments and the libraries that are written and are available for a lot of Internet of Things devices are also relatively immature. You know, if you're writing for a mature platform, there are already libraries to check certificates, to do strong authentication and so on. That generally isn't true for IoT devices. There are also, one of the things that's a big deal is that where a lot of them are, you know, it's associated with a specific product. There's a development life cycle. Once the product is sold and it's starting to, the sales are tailing off, they lose interest. So, you know, you might get 8 years of support for Chromebook from Google or 9 years from Apple. You're not to get that for a £20 IoT device. So they very frequently won't have any firmware updates. If any vulnerabilities are discovered, they won't be patched, and you will probably never even know about them. I will come on to some more specific things about what you can do about that later on, but I think the informality and the sort of lack of resources available to these devices is obviously a real stumbling block for developers.
Thank you. And there's a bit of what you're covering, or what we're actually covering today, comes into next week's show, which we've got guests from Google, and we're talking about facial recognition. But okay, so Glenn, what's your thoughts? What are you out there hacking your TV at the moment, or?
No, my TV's that old. I wouldn't do anyway. So I'm inclined to agree with most of what Simon said, and a lot of it is to do with the fact that it's done as a sideshow. But even when it's done as a dedicated product, so for example, I don't know, back in 2017, it was something I heard recently on a podcast. Someone had picked it up on it. It's a while ago now, but the Norwegian Consumer Council did a study on a bunch of smartwatches which were being sold as safety features for children. And they found loads of flaws. A bit like the VTech bit, where VTech were losing things like it was going out of fashion. But there were a couple of things that they found in the NCC report, which was obviously there were some serious control flaws, in as much as in one of the watches there was a backdoor built into it which someone could get into the watch and take control of what was inside the watch, take the data out of it, could do all of that. Right. But the other thing that came out, which is an unintended issue or an unintended vulnerability, is if, say, I buy a watch for my son and I give him that watch, and I expect that watch to be able to, you know, I'm a stalker parent and I want to know where my son is at all times, etc., etc. But if the kit that's in it's rubbish and it's not to standard and the GPS doesn't work very well, then I'm building up a false sense of security. So I'm thinking, you know what, then everything's okay, when potentially it's not, and potentially things are happening and things are going. And it's also, how secure is that transfer of data? And the other thing that goes underneath those types of things is, where's the terms and conditions? Have they actually got things like that? Does the individual know what's happening with that data? I can guarantee you that the 7-year-old doesn't care, but the parents should. And with the rise of things like Apple Watches and everybody having their smartwatch environment, these things are there and they're getting not worse, but the divide is building and it's getting bigger. I think it just needs to be really, really well advertised or well promulgated that what are the benefits of these things, because there are benefits all day long. But what are the serious vulnerabilities and the serious risks? And to the point that Simon made earlier, if it's a £20 Internet of Things watch, don't expect lots and lots of backup or support. And even if a company like Garmin, who charges however much they charge for their smartwatches, can't get it right, what hope do we all have?
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Jen, what do you think? What kind of, from a vulnerability perspective, what should our audience be considering or thinking about? I mean, you know, for two advocates of IoT, I'm feeling quite gloomy now. So
I think we talk about IoT, but I think the next step is actually NOT, which is the network of things, and how these IoT devices are connecting to one another. I'll give you an example. Someone tried to break into my house recently, and they tried to steal my dogs. Now, I'm a huge pet lover, so I decided I would buy Amazon Ring, and I was actually really reluctant to do it. But the Ring device connects with other things in my house, such as the Alexa, and it comes with a ream of other integrations, as Alexa does as well. So I feel personally that now that I've got the Ring, it's very hard to go back, because suddenly I'm using it to look outside and see if someone's there, or I hear a noise, and you know, the first thing I check in the morning used to be my email. Now it's the Ring, because I want to see if someone's outside. So I think once the cat's out of the bag almost, it's very hard to suck that in again. But in terms of vulnerability, I'm concerned not just about the devices, but the combination of devices. What are they leaking as well? And what about those integration points? Because as I understand it, that was one of the issues that we saw at Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Facebook was giving away the data, which was then being processed by third parties, and now it's out in the wild, you never get it back in again. And that's just Facebook data. If you would think about the IoT data and then the NOT, Network of Things data, I think that we need better guidelines, really, when manufacturers are making these things. I know it took, 15 years to set up RFID guidelines and to get a standard format for that. And I think these things need to happen quickly.
Well, I mean, thank you. I didn't realise that the RFID took that long. Actually, I certainly am aware that you know, the problem is a bit like the UN and a bit like the EU. You know, you've got to get lots of different parties to agree on common language, let alone the concepts. So, I mean, there is this question. I just want to touch on it briefly. I'm conscious of the time. Some questions coming through now, which is great. Keep them coming, please, audience. Just the issue of surveillance. I just want to touch it. You know, a product becomes connected. There's, you know, observation of users, obviously, which we've sort of touched on. I mean, the Garmin, he says with his Garmin watch, now I'm going to smash it because I'm now worried about what they're taking. You know, these things apparently can detect when I'm, well, doing things, you know, running up hills or doing other sporting activities, shall we say. So what's to stop people using that data? You know, so my next question is one of really data ethics. You know, how can ethics play a role here? What the concerns, and you know, what should our audience be thinking about from an ethical decision? You know, how those decisions are captured. And Jen, maybe given you're our data lead here, let's hear from you first, please. Ethics. What role does it have?
Yeah, I think in terms of ethics, customers have really got to want it when these systems are being designed. And I think we're still at the stage where people are starting to understand that the data is being given away so freely. So I've got a teenage son, and I speak to him about data, and he's just at that age, he doesn't care. He just feels it's a losing battle. Every time he picks up his iPhone, he's being tracked and traced anyway. So I think with the ethics side of things, unless organisations really want to do it, customers are going to have to ask for it. And business leaders are going to have to put themselves forward to say that they care about this. We may start to see things like the chief ethics officer, because companies want to look goods to their customers. But until customers start to ask for more ethical behaviour, we're not going to see it. I think it almost feels like the public have almost given up
Right.
itself for that, especially we look at the track and trace at the moment. It's a laughing stock, it's embarrassing, and I don't think people really want to tackle it very well.
No, well said. You heard it here on Data Matters. So I suppose, I mean, Glenn or Simon, did you want to add anything on the data ethics angle before I move on to my next question?
Yeah, I've just got one thing to add to that, which is, it's incumbent on us as a society to push it. I mean, there was an interesting line, and it's not really an Internet of Things thing, so I'm not going to digress too much, but there was an interesting line recently from ye olde CEO of Facebook. He was in front of Congress, and he was asked whether Facebook was, or social media or Facebook was designed to be addictive, or was it addictive? And the response was, well, Senator, we certainly don't design it to be. But what he's not saying is that it's not, and they know fully well that it is. But the same could be said to the IoT, as in the malaise that it's a losing battle, we've already lost, the big companies have all got my data, what's the point? Right. But the ethics thing made me automatically think of the recent thing in Washington a few years ago with Google, where they did a test where they took SIM cards out of all of the phones, turned the phones off, yet the phone still tracked where all the people were, because Google wanted that data. So where do you draw the line? Does it come, as Jenna said, from us as a society saying, no, we want you to maintain that? And the European Union has tried to implement something very similar in regards to with the e-privacy and the GDPR and all of that. But the want of the big business has to be there to be driven by that. Otherwise, it's not going to happen, I don't think.
Okay.
One thing I'd like to add to that is that I have worked with people who get quite enthusiastic about the idea of data collection, and you can see why, some really interesting ideas. And I do remember one of my colleagues, I'm not going to say where, saying, well, we'll take a risk-based decision on that. Well, I said, you can't really take a risk-based decision on breaking the law, so perhaps we should do that. But one of the things is just make sure that if you're talking about this from a corporate perspective, make sure you do know the law, and if you don't, make sure you know your data protection officer well.
Got a good lawyer.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I have some great questions coming in, some real nice tricky ones for us to answer in a moment, but before we go there, let's just close the loop on this. So in the future, intelligence services might be using the Internet of Things for identification, surveillance, monitoring, location tracking, targeting to gain access, to user credentials. And I think it was James Clapper, the US Director of National Intelligence, said in 2016 that WikiLeaks later claimed CIA had been developing security exploits for a connected TV. Now, I also remember reading and hearing many of these conspiracy theories over the years, stories, about BMW cars being hacked, the CIA listening via our TVs. Ultimately, these security vulnerabilities, can we stop them? Is there any tips, or is it, just the big off button that will, just power down, switch off that Wi-Fi? What's the answer, Simon?
Well, the answer I have about the television is I don't have a television, so sorted that one out. And I haven't had one since.
That's your spending time designing systems.
I'm too busy playing with my rotary encoder. So,
that's the answer.
There are quite a few things that you can do. I mean, I think in terms of practical tips, I think the top one is change your default passwords. Lots of devices come with a default password. It takes usually about 30 seconds of Googling to find out what that default password is. It's often very easy to identify a device from its network signature. So yeah, change the default passwords. Going back to something that Glenn said earlier on about making sure you understand, and it depends on the organisation you're dealing with whether you can trust them, but make sure you understand what they say they're doing with the data, what they're collecting and what they're doing. Think about whether you think that that's appropriate. Also think about what is actually being controlled, just how sensitive is it? If somebody can turn my heating off, then it's not the end of the world if I get a bit cold. If somebody can turn off the tank emptying system in a municipal water supply, that can be quite serious. So you do have to think about what the implications are. There are other things you can do actually as well. So one of the things that you can do is set up a separate network. So most Wi-Fi devices these days, home routers, have the capability to set up, say, a guest network that doesn't have any connection to any of your internal systems. So sometimes that's a safer thing to do. And depending on the nature of the device, it may not need any internet connection at all. So make sure you understand what the configuration options are. Turn things off if you don't need to use them. Cars are an interesting one because I have a BMW and I can lock and unlock the doors remotely. I can't start it remotely, but if somebody could subvert that, they would absolutely be able to get into my car. Now, I live in a reasonably nice place, so people aren't going to break into my car, I don't think, but there are certainly places where I would not want somebody just to be able to open my car doors. And one of the things that I would not be pleased about is driving off and then having somebody from the back seat said, hello.
Can you drop me off at the post office, please?
So understand what the devices are doing, try to get an idea of what sort of controls are in place. And normally my experience is that organisations that are quite explicit about what they're doing and quite explicit about the sort of protections that are in place normally take these things seriously. If you get an IoT device and it comes with no documentation and no privacy agreement, be suspicious. I'm suspicious all the time, but it's a nature.
Thank you. I've got. I could see Glenn was itching to come in on something, but before you do, Glenn, I've got a question here from Graham, who I think I know who that is. He's probably based in Edinburgh. And how does the move to IoT aided by 5G reinforce current trends in society with the use of social media towards conspiracy theories? And without standards, are we pushing these trends to a further extreme? So Glenn, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, that's a big question there. Thanks, Graham, for your question.
My thoughts on that is we're making it faster and we're making it quicker and we're advancing everything along with it. The more we roll out 5G, the more connectivity people have with the wider world, the more that the messages of those that will get to people's inboxes quicker. I mean, even if you just add the whole 5G conspiracy theory to that world as well, and how was it? Did I hear one recently that COVID was spread through 5G masks or whatever, or something stupid like that? But you get the idea. Technology that people don't understand, they will conjure up things to explain why we shouldn't be using it, or to the positives of why we should be using it. So I think it's going to advance everything a lot quicker.
Brilliant. Jen, I got a question for you. This is to one of the questions come from our audience. It's just touching up on the ethics point, and perhaps this, I don't want to guess who wrote this, but I have my suspicions. It says, why is this ethics? Surely it's the law. Is it a question of going beyond data protection principles or not in GDPR? I mean, why are we even getting into this ethical debate? You just got to follow the law, right?
Well, it's not as simple as that. I'll give you an example. Some of the airlines were working with a consultancy who developed an algorithm to help them to identify who was most likely to sit together or to pay to sit together on a plane. And the algorithm was designed to split them up so that they would pay more. And for me, that's quite an interesting idea, because if you are a family, then yes, you're going to pay to sit with younger family members. And believe me, you want me sitting next to my son, otherwise he would be pestering you the whole way for sweets. So that's how these things work when you're traveling with children.
Yes.
So I think although there's no law against that, there's something icky about it, because people are making profit out of something that seems to just be happening anyway, that families sit together. And I think there are going to be more cases like that with IoT and with privacy, where it might not be against the law, but it feels that it's against the spirit of what the company should be doing. And I think that's the issue for me. It's not just the law. The law always seems to be playing catch up.
Can I just add to that, actually, because that last point is a point well made. I was the CISO at Morrison's. Morrison's had a security incident. It was everything. Eventually, Morrison's was found not to be liable or guilty. But this all hinged on an interpretation of the Data Protection Act, which by that time was 22 years old. So the GDPR is considerably more complex. Knowing what the law is just isn't that obvious. So our case, the Morrison's case, actually ended up going to the Supreme Court, and a decision was made, but that was on 22-year-old legislation. So it can take a long time really fully to understand what the implications of the law are. So certainly from my own company's perspective, we do take ethics seriously, and we would go considerably further than just complying with the law. We really want to do the right thing for our customers, not just say we have done the bare minimum and just obeyed the law. I always hope we would go further than that.
No, it's brilliant, and I mean it's a fantastic point, and I'm glad to our anonymous person asking that question, because often with data protection, people just treat this as a legal thing, and it's not. It's a question of ethics. It's also a question of risk, and so the question also that I've been wanting to ask my panel was around data protection impact assessments for IoTs. I mean, given the question is, given limited firmware or the limitations of firmware and software, which Simon quite rightly identified as being sort of immature, how can we do how can we do a DPIA on an IoT type of device or initiative? Is that something we should be doing as professionals? Shall I start with you, Glenn?
I mean, you can do. I don't know whether. In my mind, yes, we should still be doing them, regardless of the immaturity of the firmware or the software, because it's not just about what the remediation is that you're going to put in place around stopping that data from being breached or leaked. What you as an organization or as a company need to understand is what is the impact. On the whole point of doing the DPIA is to understand the impact of that breach of data on the individual, because at the end of the day, we as organizations don't own that data. It's not ours, it's still that person's data. So we need to understand what the impact is on them if it's breached through the immaturity of the firmware or the software or whatever design architecture we've built to make our Internet of Things work.
Yeah, I think that's where the Chief Ethics Officer starts to come in, actually, because I think I'm starting to see businesses, when they're thinking about scoping out projects and programs, they're starting to ask a really different question, which is, what harm might this do? And that's a good way to think about people's data, regardless of whether it's an IoT device, an NOT system, or just a regular data-based system. I'm seeing more of that, and I think that's a good thing, not just because for the individual who owns the data, but also a risk assessment for the business, whether that's financial, legal, reputational, operational. It's a good thing.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And lots of questions coming in around your airline example, Jen, because I think I was possibly one of those passengers that had selected not to pay, but then when I got on board, pinched my child's leg, so he was screaming. Strangely enough, the people just opened up and gave you their seats away. I mean, it was just absolutely fantastic. The other one to do is obviously having a sick child and having a little sick bag as you walk on. You'll be surprised at how accommodating people can be. Anyway, enough of tips on how to get onto airline places. Okay, so look, we've got lots of questions, but I actually want to just ask this question, because I think this is a really good one about voice-enabled chatbots, because we've seen this is a real business advantage, and lots of the businesses that I advise have these chat boxes, huge amounts of efficiency driven through, and is that something, that given the explosion of AI and just the way that machine learning is advancing these days, Is that something we should be concerned about in the future, Jen? Is it you know, should we just accept that, or you know, encourage the, you know, the evolution, if you like?
I think automation is a good thing in some ways because it gives you better customer service, so I can see the benefit. But the issue is as well, automation has a consequence, I guess, for the fourth industrial revolution. What's going to happen there? People are going to start to lose jobs, so there's a concern there, I think. I think also, what are people doing with that technology? I did speak to somebody from Amazon who will remain nameless, who said that about 50% of the utterances made to Alexa were actually swearing and so I wonder what we're encouraging by dehumanizing that communication in some way. Are we all going to turn into an episode of EastEnders or whatever the soap opera is, Big Brother, where they're all shouting at each other all the time? So I think that chatbots can do a great job of automating, but we need to be careful in some ways that we don't lose the humanity in our communications with people, and how we reconcile the two, I'm not sure.
No, that's brilliant. And Simon?
Just very quick, there's a very interesting story in the news about chatbots. Ticketmaster was fined £1.5 million, I think, to do with the chatbot. But I think one thing that I thought was very interesting from a privacy perspective was Google, and I think it may have been Amazon, admitting that human beings do actually listen to some of the messages, not because there's meant to be a privacy invasion, but for the purpose of quality control and checking the way the algorithm works. However, it does mean that random utterances may be listened to by some random person who knows where. And that certainly didn't seem to be covered in the privacy terms and conditions that I read anyway.
And closing thoughts then, Glenn, you know, given everything, well, I mean, we've had some wonderful information. Thank you so much for coming on this panel today. You know, I've learned too. Closing thoughts, tips, top tips. Glenn, don't stand up in a canoe. Anything else?
Yellow snow.
That's it. Yes.
The classic ones are available. I would suggest it's advancing and it's something that is not going to go away. We do have to accept that IoT and NOT are here to stay. Right. But what we do need to do is make sure that we as subscribers and users of this technology are au fait, aware and sensitive to how the data is being captured, where that data is going, what the organizations who are capturing it are doing with it. To the Simon's point there, everybody just assumed that you spoke to Alexa and that was it, but no, someone somewhere has to check that what they've actually written works. But then it comes down to businesses and organizations such as Google and Amazon to highlight that to the fact to their customers. So there's a bit of both, bit of give and take on both sides, I think. Bit of give and take on both sides.
Simon, any top tips from you on what we can be doing? Yeah, I mean, fantastic about the, you know, the default password. I was surprised how often that.
Yeah. I think the other thing is just to say, make sure you understand what's actually happening. So if you're buying a device, make sure you understand what sort of connectivity it has. Make sure you actually do bother to read what they're doing with the information, because certainly within Europe, there are quite explicit requirements about saying exactly what you're going to do with it. It's much more difficult in the United States, where the privacy protections are almost non-existent. So just make sure you're properly informed about what the device does, what information it will collect, and what they will do with it. And yeah, that will tell you a lot about whether you can trust the organisation. If there's no information at all, then you almost certainly can't.
Wonderful. And Jen, any final thoughts?
I would suggest people do their research and keep up to date. The reality is, any technology people will work at ways of how to get into it and use it for nefarious means. I even remember the phreaking incidents that we used to see in telephones, where you could sense the noise of the button down. And so there's all sorts of things. Just keep up to date, keep reading, and look after yourselves.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Listen, absolutely brilliant. Simon, Glenn, Jen, What a fantastic panel you've been this week, and sadly, once again, we've run out of time. This just goes so quickly, but we try to make it 40 odd minutes to keep it tight. We know how busy everybody is. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Next week, just as a plug, we are actually deep diving into facial recognition and video surveillance. Of course, we're going to touch on the COVID tracing apps, it goes without saying. Next week's guests are two guests from Google, Jutta Ubelin and Rainer Keisler, and also DPO from Redbridge, Joanna Mokalosdial, and they will be talking about this subject. So tune in next week, same time, Friday, the 27th at 2 o'clock. Just big thanks to all of you, for your audience, to the audience for your questions. Keep them coming. Any feedback, please, anything you want to see more of, less of, let us know. We want to bring this to you every week, to our community, so that we can all benefit. But thanks again for tuning, and until next week, this is Steve Wright.